The first crunch wasn't my bone, but it was close enough to make me vomit. It was the sound of a hyena's jaw, capable of 100 pounds of pressure, snapping a dry branch just inches from my feet. I am not a person anymore. I am a piece of meat that hasn't stopped moving yet. The infection in my side screams with every breath. A jagged tear from a thorn bush that is now a feast for 1,000 flies. I can smell myself rotting in the midday heat, and I know they can smell it too. The African sun isn't golden or majestic. It is a white-hot executioner. It burns the moisture out of your eyeballs until blinking feels like rubbing sandpaper against your brain. I've lost 12 pounds in 3 days. My ribs are visible. My skin is the color of old parchment, and my tongue is a swollen, useless lump of wood in my mouth. To move is to die of heat stroke. To stay still is to be eaten alive. They don't wait for you to die. That's the lie the movies tell you. Hyenas start eating while the heart is still beating. I watched them do it to a zebra foal yesterday. Now, the lead female is looking at me. She doesn't see a man with a family or a bank account. She sees a limping, dehydrated animal with a hole in its flank. Night is falling, the temperature is plummeting, and my flashlight flickers like a dying pulse. This isn't a documentary. This is the last line of survival, and the laughter in the dark is getting louder. The Land Rover's engine didn't just stop. It died with a metallic wheeze that signaled the end of my safety. 1 minute I was a tourist with a camera, the next a ghost in the dust. The sandstorm hit like a wall of red glass, erasing the horizon and my group in seconds. When the wind finally settled, the silence was absolute. No voices, no tires on gravel, just the heat. I checked my gear. A half-empty canteen and a compass spinning aimlessly due to the iron-rich rocks. My GPS was a black brick in my hand. I am standing in the middle of a furnace, miles from the nearest outpost, with nothing but grass and predators between me and life. The transition from observer to prey is complete. Every minute spent standing still is a minute of dehydration I can't afford. The silence of the first morning was a lie. I woke up with my face pressed into the dirt, the copper taste of dust coating my throat. My group was gone, and the horizon was a flat, searing line of indifference. I didn't scream. Screaming wastes moisture. I just stood up, my knees buckling, and realized that my shadow was the only friend I had left. The wound in my side throbbed in time with my pulse. A jagged branch had sliced through my skin during the frantic run through the dust storm. It wasn't deep, but in this heat, it was a death sentence. The flies found me within minutes. Metallic green scavengers that crawled into the raw edges of the cut, searching for salt and fluid. By midday, the African sun became a physical weight. It felt like standing behind a jet engine. Every breath felt like inhaling powdered glass. I tried to walk north, but the landscape cheated. The shimmering heat created lakes of water that vanished as I approached. My brain was cooking inside my skull, turning logic into a blurred mess of survival instincts. Movement caught my eye to the left. A golden shape, low to the ground, slipping between the dry brush. It wasn't a lion. It was too small, too hunched. It was a scout, a lone hyena, testing the air. It smelled the infection before I even felt the fever. It wasn't attacking yet, just measuring the distance between my life and its next meal. I found a rock, heavy and sharp-edged, and gripped it until my knuckles turned white. My hands were peeling, the skin blistering under the relentless UV rays. I threw the stone. It landed short, kicking up a puff of red dust. The hyena didn't run. It simply sat down and stared at me with unblinking obsidian eyes. It knew I couldn't throw a second one. The afternoon was a slow crawl through a furnace. My boots felt like they were filled with lead. I had lost the trail hours ago, and my internal compass was spinning. Every step sent a jolt of agony from my side through my entire torso. I was losing more fluid through the wound than I was through sweat. I reached a dried-up riverbed, a graveyard of bleached bones and cracked mud. There was no water, only the memory of it. I dug into the sand with my fingernails, desperate for a hint of dampness, but found only parched earth. My fingernails cracked and bled, the red staining the grey sand. I was digging my own grave without realizing it. As the sun began to dip, the temperature didn't just drop, it collapsed. The heat was replaced by a biting dry chill that made my muscles seize. This is when the fear truly arrived. The day was a battle against the sun, but the night was a battle against things with teeth. I needed height, but the Savanna offered nothing but thorns. I saw the pack gathering at the edge of the riverbed. 3, then 5, then 7 pairs of glowing eyes. They didn't bark. They communicated in low, guttural chuffs. They were flanking me, cutting off the exit to the high ground. My injury made me slow, and they were experts at identifying a limp. I backed myself against a granite boulder, the cold stone biting into my spine. I had a small pocket knife and a dying flashlight. The lead hyena stepped into the dim light, its powerful jaws dripping with anticipation. The first night of the hunt had begun, and I was the only thing on the menu. The first night was a symphony of fear. Every rustle of dry grass, every distant chuff was a drumbeat against my ribs. My only solace was the fading light of my flashlight, a tiny defiant sun against an ocean of predatory darkness. I pressed myself against the cold granite, the small pocket knife a pathetic extension of my trembling hand. They moved like liquid shadows, circling. Their eyes, those eerie amber reflections, were the only constants. They didn't rush. They were testing, probing, waiting for my nerve to break, for the first sign of weakness that wasn't already glaringly obvious. The leader, a massive female with a scarred muzzle, kept her gaze fixed on me. I tried to keep my breathing shallow, my movements minimal. The wound in my side pulsed with a dull, insistent ache, a constant reminder of my vulnerability. I could feel the fever creeping in, turning my thoughts hazy, blurring the line between reality and the night's terrifying whispers. A sudden sharp bark shattered the stillness, not from the pack, but from far off. Another answering call. Reinforcements. My blood ran cold, not from the chill, but from the realization that my lone predator problem was about to become a pack-level nightmare. I knew I couldn't stay. To stand my ground against a growing pack was suicide. I had to move, even with my injury. The boulder offered some defense, but it was a trap if they decided to rush. I had to find a different kind of refuge. My eyes scanned the sparse landscape. A cluster of dense, thorny bushes, maybe 100 yards away. Not ideal, but better than being exposed. The ground between me and them was a minefield of dry twigs and sharp stones. Every step would announce my presence. I waited for a moment of distraction. It came when a distant antelope cry echoed across the savanna. The pack leader paused, her attention momentarily split. This was my chance. I launched myself forward, a clumsy, painful sprint, the rock in my hand ready. The moment I moved, they reacted. A chorus of guttural chuffs, the sound of heavy paws pounding the dry earth. They were fast, far faster than I was. I could hear them gaining, the air behind me thick with their panting breath. The thorns of the bushes seemed to recede, then rush closer. I plunged into the thorny sanctuary, ignoring the tearing of my clothes and skin. The thorns bit deep, but they were a shield. I curled into a ball, trying to be as small and invisible as possible. The hyenas circled the perimeter, their snorts and frustrated growls just inches from my hiding place. The night wore on, a brutal standoff. The moon climbed high, casting stark shadows. I could smell them, their musky wild scent, a constant sickening reminder of my predicament. I held the pocket knife, its small blade reflecting the moonlight. My life hung by a thread, waiting for dawn, waiting for them to give up. Dawn was a cruel, incandescent joke. The sun didn't bring warmth. It brought a blinding white glare that felt like red-hot needles driven into my scorched retinas. The hyenas had retreated into the shimmering golden shadows of the long grass, but I knew they hadn't left. They were merely outsourcing their killing to the sun, waiting for the Saharan heat to boil the last of the moisture from my marrow. My throat felt like it had been packed with dry, jagged cement, and every rhythmic pulse in my side was a sledgehammer blow against my ribs. I crawled out from the skeletal embrace of the thorn bush, my khaki safari shirt now a collection of stiff, blood-browned rags held together by grime and salt. My skin was a roadmap of dehydration, cracked and peeling in long, translucent strips that fluttered in the dry wind. I managed to find a small, shaded hollow beneath a jagged rock overhang, a temporary sanctuary from the solar assault. I lay there, paralyzed by exhaustion, watching a disciplined line of black ants march across the red dust, envying their mindless purpose and their terrifying resilience. The hallucinations began to bleed into reality around noon. The horizon started to liquefy, melting into a deceptive pool of cobalt blue that mocked my thirst. I saw the Land Rover parked just over the next ridge, its white paint gleaming, the engine idling with a hum I could almost feel in my teeth. I saw my group, the guide, the photographer, the friends I'd lost, waving at me with wide, cheerful grins. They were calling my name. Their voices carried on a breeze that felt like a furnace blast. I tried to stand, my knees buckling under the weight of my own dying cells. I launched myself into a desperate, staggering run toward the ridge, my boots heavy as lead. But with every agonizing step, the ridge receded, stretched thin by the warping atmosphere. I fell, my face slamming into the white-hot sand, and tasted the metallic tang of a split lip. As I lay there, I realized I was chasing a ghost made of light and desperation, a cruel trick played by a brain that was slowly cooking inside its own skull. A vulture circled high above, a solitary black speck etched against the bleached, merciless blue of the sky. It was patient, a silent auditor of the dying. It knew that in this landscape, time is not a measurement, but a predator that always wins. I looked at the small pocket knife still clutched in my hand. It felt impossibly heavy now, an anchor dragging me toward the earth. I wasn't a hunter, a survivor, or even a man anymore. I was just a slow-motion meal, a collection of proteins waiting for the temperature to peak. The silence of the desert was absolute, yet my ears were ringing with a high-pitched electric scream. I tried to scream back, to defy the emptiness, but only a dry, rattling hiss escaped my lips. My tongue was a swollen, foreign object in my mouth, too large to move, too dry to taste. The sand beneath me began to feel like a bed of velvet, an invitation to stop fighting, to let the fever take the wheel and drive me into the dark. I watched the ants again, fascinated by their indifference to the apocalypse I was enduring. They stepped over the mountains of sand I had disturbed, oblivious to the titan dying beside them. To them, I was just a geographical obstacle that would soon become a bountiful terrain. The thought should have terrified me, but in my delirium, it felt like a strange kind of justice. I was being reclaimed by the land I had come to photograph, my ego dissolving into the grit. Shadows began to grow long and distorted, stretching across the salt pan like the fingers of a reaching god. The temperature didn't drop. The air just grew heavy and stagnant, a suffocating blanket of orange light. Every breath was a struggle against the thickening atmosphere, my lungs feeling like they were inhaling powdered glass. I reached for my empty canteen, shaking it one last time, hoping for a miracle. But only the hollow echo of metal on metal answered. I found a small fibrous root protruding from the parched earth and clawed at it with broken fingernails. I shoved the bitter woody mass into my mouth, chewing with raw jaw muscles, praying for a single drop of sap. It tasted like dirt and ancient death, but I swallowed it anyway, a symbolic gesture of my refusal to simply vanish. My vision flickered, the edges of the world turning black and fraying like burnt paper, as the sun began its slow, agonizing descent. The final descent into dusk brought a new kind of terror. As the light failed, the silhouettes of the hyenas reappeared on the rim of the dry lake bed. They weren't hiding anymore. They sat on their haunches, watching me with the patient gaze of creditors waiting to collect a debt. I felt a single heavy drop of sweat roll down my forehead and sting my eye. I didn't blink. I couldn't afford to miss the moment the world finally decided I had had enough. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, but it didn't bring peace. The sky turned the colour of a fresh bruise, deep purples and sickly indigos, before settling into a suffocating starless black. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted, the searing heat of the day replaced by a dry crystalline chill that made my joints feel like they were being pried apart with crowbars. My shredded khaki shirt offered no warmth, and I began to shiver with such violence that my teeth rattled in my skull. I was caught in the cruelest cycle of the Savanna. Boiling by day, freezing by night, the hyenas began their move as the first sliver of the moon rose. They didn't growl or roar like lions, they giggled. It was a high-pitched manic sound that echoed off the dry rock formations, a sonic manifestation of madness. They were closer now, the amber reflections of their eyes dancing in the periphery of my vision like fireflies from hell. I could hear their heavy paws crunching on the salt crust of the lake bed, rhythmic and relentless. They were no longer testing me. They were positioning themselves for the final harvest. I tried to crawl toward a higher outcrop of boulders, but my muscles were unresponsive, stiffened by the cold and the cumulative trauma of the past 48 hours. My fingers, raw and bleeding from digging for roots, clawed at the sand, but I only managed to drag myself a few inches. The pack leader, the scarred female, stepped into the faint moonlight. She was less than 10 yards away, her powerful neck muscles tensing as she lowered her head. I could smell her now, the stench of old blood, rotting carrion, and wild, unwashed fur. In a moment of pure adrenaline-fueled lucidity, I remembered the small signal flare at the bottom of my camera bag. I had forgotten it in the delirium of the day. My hand shook as I reached for the side pocket, my numb fingers fumbling with the zipper. I could hear the hyenas breathing, a wet, expectant sound that filled the silence. One of the younger males lunged, a flash of grey fur snapping at my boot. I kicked out with my remaining strength, the impact sending a jolt of agony through my hip. My fingers finally closed around the cold plastic of the flare. It was a one-shot chance, a tiny plastic tube against a pack of professional killers. I waited, holding my breath, as the pack leader took another step. She was preparing to lunge for my throat, her upper lip curling back to reveal massive bone-crushing molars. The world seemed to slow down, the ringing in my ears intensifying until it was a roar. I pointed the flare upward, my thumb hovering over the trigger. The flare ignited with a deafening thump and a blinding burst of crimson light. For a split second, the Savanna was bathed in a hellish, artificial noon. The hyenas shrieked in confusion, the sudden brilliance searing their nocturnal eyes. They scattered, their shadows dancing wildly against the rocks like panicked demons. The red orb arched into the sky, trailing a plume of thick smoke, before slowly drifting down towards the horizon. It was a beautiful, desperate cry for help in an empty world. The silence that followed the flare was even heavier than before. The hyenas had retreated into the darkness, but I knew the effect was temporary. Predators like them are smart. They would eventually realize the light wasn't a threat, just a distraction. But for now, I had earned a few minutes of life. I used that time to pull myself further up the rocks, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My vision was failing again, the edges of my consciousness fraying like a worn rope. I looked up at the stars, which were finally beginning to pierce through the high-altitude haze. They looked like cold, indifferent diamonds scattered on black velvet. I wondered if anyone saw my flare. A ranger on patrol? A distant village? Or was I just lighting up my own funeral pyre? The cold was becoming an anesthetic, numbing the pain in my side, turning my limbs into heavy logs. I felt a strange, detached peace, a surrender to the inevitable gravity of the earth. A low, guttural moan escaped my lips, not a cry for help, but a sound of pure exhaustion. I closed my eyes for what felt like a second, but when I opened them, the moon had moved significantly. The hyenas were back, closer than before, their silhouettes crouching at the base of my rock. They were silent now, no longer giggling. They knew I had no more tricks. The scarred female was at the very edge of the boulder, her eyes level with mine. Just as the lead hyena tensed her hind legs for the final jump, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't a bark or a giggle. It was the low, distant rumble of a diesel engine, accompanied by the sweeping arc of powerful headlights cutting through the dust. The hyenas turned their heads, their eyes reflecting the approaching white light. I tried to shout, but my voice was gone. I could only watch as the lights grew brighter, a pair of artificial suns coming to claim me from the dark. The headlights didn't just bring light, they brought the crushing weight of reality. As the Land Rover roared closer, the engine's vibrations felt like they were reassembling my shattered bones. The hyenas, those persistent architects of my demise, dissolved into the shadows like smoke caught in a gale. They didn't leave with a fight. They simply vanished, their business with me concluded by the intrusion of steel and combustion. When the vehicle finally screeched to a halt, the dust it kicked up tasted like life itself, dry, bitter, and solid. The doors flew open, and voices, human, panicked, familiar, shattered the crystalline silence of the night. Strong arms, smelling of tobacco and old leather, hoisted me from the jagged altar of my rock. I was a dead weight, a collection of parched skin and brittle spirit. They wrapped me in a heavy wool blanket that felt like a lead shroud, but the warmth it provided was the first true mercy I had felt in 48 hours. My group was shouting, crying, their faces illuminated by the dashboard lights, looking like ghosts from a world I no longer belonged to. As they poured the first capful of water into my mouth, my body rebelled. My throat, narrowed by dehydration, seized up in a violent spasm. I coughed, the liquid feeling like molten silver sliding down a rusted pipe. Slowly, the world began to regain its edges. The interior of the car was a cockpit of civilization. The smell of diesel, the glow of the radio, the soft hum of the air conditioning. It felt alien, an artificial bubble floating in a sea of primal indifference. We drove away, and I watched the Savanna recede through the cracked rear window. The landscape that had tried to swallow me now looked indifferent, a vast expanse of silver-grey grass under the moon. I looked at my hands. My fingernails were gone, replaced by raw, dark scabs. My khaki shirt was a ruin, a testament to the thorns that had both hunted and protected me. I wasn't just tired, I was hollowed out, as if the desert had reached inside and taken anything that wasn't strictly necessary for survival. The hospital in the distant town was a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. They poked and prodded, their needles seeking veins that had collapsed like dry riverbeds. They spoke of severe dehydration, second-degree burns, and trauma. But the words felt small, insufficient to describe the dance I had shared with the hyenas. To them, I was a medical case. To the Savanna, I had been an equation of calories and time. Days later, I sat on the porch of a small clinic, watching the sun rise again. This time, it didn't look like a predator. It was just a star, distant and cold. I held a glass of water, watching the condensation bead on the glass, a miracle of moisture that I would never take for granted again. My skin was still peeling, a shedding of the man I used to be. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the giggling of the pack, a sound that lived in the marrow of my bones. The guide came to visit me, his face etched with a guilt he didn't deserve. He told me they had searched for miles, but the dust storm had erased my world in seconds. He looked at my scars, the jagged line on my side, the raw patches on my knees, and nodded slowly. He knew that the Savanna doesn't just leave marks on the body, it carves itself into the mind. We didn't talk much. In that silence, there was a shared understanding that I had crossed a line few ever return from. I returned to the city, but the city felt like a lie. The noise was too loud, the lights too bright, the people too hurried. I found myself waking up at 3 a.m., my heart racing, convinced I could smell the musky scent of a predator in my bedroom. I would go to the kitchen, pour a glass of water, and just listen to the silence. I was haunted not by the fear of dying, but by the terrifying clarity of what it means to be alive when everything else wants you dead. I kept the torn khaki shirt. I didn't wash it. It sat in a box in the back of my closet, still smelling of red dust and dried sweat. It was my anchor, a reminder that the world is not always paved and lit by street lamps. Sometimes I would take it out and run my fingers over the holes left by the thorns. It was the only thing that felt real in a world of screens and convenience. A year later, I looked at the photos I had taken before the storm. They were beautiful, but they were empty. They captured the light, but not the heat. They showed the animals, but not the hunger. I realized then that I didn't need the photos to remember. Every time I took a breath, every time I felt the wind on my face, I knew I was a survivor, not because I was stronger, but because I had refused to stop rastejando, crawling. The Savanna was still out there, patient and vast, and I carried a piece of its silence within me, forever. The Savanna doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. It is a mirror, showing you exactly what you are when the world stops being polite. I left my blood in that red dust, and in return, I took a piece of the silence with me. Every glass of water, every breath of cool air, every sunrise is no longer a given. It is a victory. I am a survivor, and though the scars on my skin will eventually fade, the lion's heart I discovered in the dark will beat within me forever. Some journeys don't end when you get home. They only begin when you realize you were never truly alone out there.